I'd like to focus in this video on putting together a lesson plan. And by contrast to a unit plan, which we actually did when we planned the Shmitat Ksafim unit, I personally think that there should be a unit plan first, and then once you have a unit plan, then to divide it into a lesson plan. Once we have this content that we want to teach, this package, this material that we want to teach that describes, in our example, what are the important halachot of Shmitat Ksafim and Prose Bowl. Now, how do we divide that up into lessons and make a plan for each lesson? So the first thing is sort of obvious that every lesson should have a beginning, middle, end. There should be a structure to the lesson that has an organization and an arc, and that there's a full circle, beginning, middle, end. The reason why that's a little bit of a novelty is because it's not really an end, because each lesson comprises of one big unit. So we're really arbitrarily dividing the unit into, let's say you have 40-minute classes, you're dividing the unit into 40-minute pieces, and then each piece now has to also be framed as a complete cohesive concept or lesson, so that there'll be some sort of closure and then opening the next day. That is not to say that you can't, let's say one day you didn't fully complete what you wanted to teach yesterday, you can come in the next day and say, I want to clarify something from yesterday's class, and then start today's class or today's material. The days don't need to be completely distinct, but there should be some structure to each lesson, each and every day. So that's the first thing. The first thing is to think about a lesson as a piece of a unit with its own structure. People talk about the idea of having a motivatia, something that's going to engage the students in the material. Traditionally, a motivatia is something that happens at the beginning of a lesson. We want to get the students engaged in the material, so we say something or do something that is engaging. So it might be to connect the material to something that's involved, that's interesting in the students' lives, and bring them into the material in that way. A motivatia, I don't think it has to happen. It's not something that's completely required, but it is very useful. But I think we should also think about different forms of a motivation. There's an extrinsic and an intrinsic motivation. An extrinsic motivation would be to say something like, the material reminds me of what happened in the football game yesterday, and to talk about the game and show a connection and then move into the material. But it's really like loosely connected, but it got them listening and thinking, and that's great. Doesn't hurt. And a motivation that has some intrinsic meaning would be to take the material and to think about how the material could be meaningful to students. Like you come in and you're thinking, I'm going to teach this Gemara, I'm going to teach this pasuk, I'm going to teach this halacha, and then and the reason is because it's an important halacha. But then to think about, is this halacha something that's really meaningful and connects to struggles that people have in their lives, or things that happen in life? And then the motivation can be like, did you ever have a situation when you had this kind of miscommunication with your friend? Well, that's what this halacha really is about. So it's really about thinking more deeply into the material we're learning and seeing how it could actually connect to the students, and then bringing that out. Now, it makes sense to do it at the beginning of a lesson, but it doesn't have to be at the beginning of the lesson. It might not flow in that particular time. It might happen in the middle of the lesson, which is okay also, because that's just when students are starting to space out and wonder why we're talking about this. Very often, it depends on the class, very often the students are engaged at the beginning. They're supposed to listen, they're supposed to be focused. They know that that's their job, so they might be engaged at the beginning, but they might drift away if it feels very uninteresting or non-relevant. So therefore, in the middle of the lesson, it could also be very useful. So having an organizational structure was number one. Number two, finding a way to connect students to the content that's being studied. Number three is that a lesson plan should really be or planned out in advance. There is a enormous drop off in preparation from year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3 of teaching. But really, I would strongly recommend that in the first year or two of teaching, that a lesson plan should be written out. It could be there's various formats that people use to write their lesson plans, or they just write notes in their notebook or type notes. But a teacher should really plan out step by step what's going to happen at each stage of the lesson. Because it's very hard to just like sort of wing it and play it by ear. It doesn't come out as good. So there should be how am I starting, then what's happening, and then what's happening, how am I closing the lesson. There should also be a plan of what's going to be textual, what's going to be conceptual, what's going to be discussion, what's going to be chavruta when students are learning with pairs, whether it's discussing questions or reading text, what's going to be done as a group, what's going to be focused textually, what's going to be focused conceptually. The board, the whiteboard, or the slides should be planned in advance. What's my board going to look like during this lesson? Let me think about how I can portray the material that we're learning on the board, and when will I write that on the board? And there should be in the lesson plan notes a point in the lesson where it says, now write this on the board, and there should be a picture of the board. The board shouldn't just, we spoke about board work, but the board shouldn't just pop up like, oh, maybe I'll write this on the board. But really, when we're planning the lesson, thinking about what will be useful to write on the board and what will it look like, and write the board in your notes. I think also a very important thing to do when planning a lesson is what questions will I ask the students? A lot of times teachers are speaking and they realize, like, oh, I'm talking too much, so I'll throw out, instead of saying the next thing, I'll throw out a question. But the question is not always formulated in a way that's really going to elicit good conversation. So really thinking about, what am I teaching? What's the questions that I want to discuss? And how do I frame the questions to the class in a way that will elicit, let's say you want to elicit a conversation. I want to elicit a discussion. So how do I frame a question that will really lead to that? So I think that a really good thing to write down in your notes in your lesson plan is the questions that I'm going to ask and how am I going to frame them. And then a teacher who's teaching, let's say, 2 sections of the same course is really lucky, because you ask the question and then you realize I needed to reframe that. And then you try it again in the other class, and there could be a big difference. Okay, the next thing is that there needs to be essential questions for the unit, and those have to be communicated at some point. So let's just take the Shemitah example. So you're essentially, what am I really trying to? What's the entire unit really addressing? What questions are we trying to engage? So it might be, okay, to teach the halachos of Shmitas Ksafim, I want students to understand what a prose bowl is, because people are going to be doing them soon. But maybe within the material, what's really the question that the unit is really driven by? Not just like, oh, I chose this halacha, you chose that halacha. We all chose the content that we want to teach as part of this unit because we thought there was a reason why this is the best material to teach. Why? What are the essential questions? So it might be in our unit, maybe what does the prose bowl tell us about the way halacha works, or what's the value what are the values that underlie the laws of Shmitas Ksafim? And there could be a lot of steps along the way of first, they have to know what Shmitas Ksafim is, that it applies to a loan. What are the basic Mishnayot, the Psukim, the basic halachot, what's most Asheros based in. There's a lot of pieces along the way, but ultimately, what is the prose bowl, and what does it tell us about how halacha develops, or what are the values that underlie Shmitas Ksafim? So, So I hope this was helpful in a lesson planning, but really to break down the unit into specific lessons. Each lesson should have its own almost like a mini unit where there's a beginning, a middle, an end, where there's a motivation, there's something that connects the students to the material. By the way, the essential question and the motivation and the motivatia are connected, because if you think about what the topic is really about, then we can make that the motivatia, and then engage the students in actually the core themes we're trying to get at. What are the questions I want to ask my students during the class? What should I be writing on the board? What homework will we be left with? And lastly, I didn't mention this before, is checking for understanding. What questions will I ask as review to make sure the students understand it? What activities will I do to really ensure that the entire class understands what I was teaching? So with that, I think we could all write a lesson plan on one of the lessons of the unit of Shemitah Ksafim. The last thing that I wanted to mention is a little bit unrelated to lesson planning, but came up in the previous lessons and assignments, was the question of where to put the Tamei HaMikra, the Tamei HaMitzvos. So the reasons for, let's say, Shemitah's Ksafim, should that be taught at the beginning or at the end? Someone mentioned maybe it would be problematic to make it to do it towards the beginning, because then students might not buy it or find the halachot aren't completely consistent and then reject something. So I think it's a very good question. I think it's a very good question whether the Tamei HaMitzvah are best introduced at the beginning or at the end. Maybe once we've learned the halacha, we can think of the Tamei HaMitzvah, but I just think it points to another really important thing, which is it's really important to speak to students about what Tamei HaMitzvot are. And the fact that Tamei, and I teach this in almost every time, every course, I get to this at some point, that what are Tamei HaMitzvah? They're speculative as to the value that underlies the mitzvah, that by learning the halacha, the tam, whether it's a valid tam, depends on whether it fits with the halachos of the mitzvah, at least for the most part. So if you have a tam and then the mitzvah, the halachos don't manifest that, don't represent the tam, so that's just a proof that the speculative tam is not correct. We know that the halacha is true and binding, but and the halacha would hopefully give us clues as to what the value is, but the value answers to the halachot and not the reverse. In the case of Shemitah's Ksafim, I think it's I think it's interesting to sort of pose the question from the very beginning, to read the psukim and to think about what we think the goal of the mitzvah is, but with the caveat that this is just what we think, and we'll see as we learn more if it's really consistent with the halachot of Shemitah Ksafim. I do think that bringing up at the beginning in this particular unit and then coming back to it at the end really is an effective method of going about it. And I think that in our case, I mean, I personally think that the mitzvah, I think there's two main ta'amim that are really relevant. One is just generally like everything belongs to Hashem. Whatever He tells us to forego, we have to listen. And the other is really about our relationship with the poor, which I think is really front and center in the psukim, in many halachot. And I think that besides the Gemara's analysis of Prose Bowl and Shemitah's Derabanan, so the Chacham Kamim Masakim Prose Bowl, etc., if you think about the overall goal of Shemitah Ksafim as a way of helping those in need, I think the Prose Bowl actually reinforces the main goal of the mitzvah rather than compromises it. And I think that's part of why the Prose Bowl exists.